So, welcome everybody, and we're very happy to be here to discuss this topic of digital technologies and peace building and conflict. Thank you so much, Ambassador and Conciliation Resources and the embassy staff for inviting us to this panel. My name is Elena. I'm the co-founder and strategy lead at Build Up, which is a nonprofit that works on peace building in the digital era. On this panel, I'll be joined by Zigwai Ayuba, who you're seeing up here, who's a national expert at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and she's based in Nigeria. Dr. Christine Cheng, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College, and also a trustee at Conciliation Resources. Enrico Formica, who's a senior mediation officer at the Mediation Support Unit in the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and is based in Geneva. And Dr. Andreas Helbinger, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Center on Conflict, Development and Peacebuilding, is also at the Graduate Institute and a visiting researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. I really had to write that down, Andreas, because there was no way I was going to remember it. So I'm really pleased to have these incredible minds joining today to discuss this topic of digital technologies and conflict and peace building. It's quite a broad topic, as you can tell from the title. I wanted to just start with a few thoughts to frame the discussion. And these thoughts are really also a reflection on my personal journey into working with digital technologies in peace building and conflict. We started at Build Up, the organization that I started, by asking ourselves a question: what uses of digital technology can support peace building work? What can be done with digital technologies that can support peace building work? And really, we were thinking about technology as a tool at this point. And so we were thinking, there are data management technologies that can support peace builders in gathering data that can help prevent conflicts, as the ambassador was sharing before. There are digital technologies that can help in strategic communications and can increase the number and the diversity of voices that are welcome into a dialogue about peace building. There are networking technologies that can encourage new connections to happen, connections that weren't possible before, whether it was because there was a physical barrier or because there was a resource constraint, or a number of different reasons. And so for the first few years of the work that we were doing at Build Up, this is really what we focused on. We focused on how can we work with different local peace builders across the world to really innovate the way that peace building is done, to increase the impact of peace building work through the use of data technologies, through the use of strategic communications technologies and networking technologies. And that led to some really interesting work, right? So just to give you some examples, we worked with a group of Syrian activists to build a digital game that provided a very different space in which to talk about the differences in identity across Syria. We worked with a local peacebuilding organization in Burundi to run participatory surveys across Burundi with youth that would reveal what their priorities for peace were, and then used a data dashboard to discuss that data directly with policymakers, so that youth and policymakers were coming together around this digital dashboard. We did a number of really interesting things, and we started to build this community of peace innovators across the world. And one of the things that started to happen as we did that, we run an annual conference. It's called Build Peace, and if any of you are interested, it's happening in Germany this year, so please have a look, because it's an interesting venue for these kind of discussions. And some of what started to happen in the conversations at that conference is that a lot of the activists that we were working with started saying, absolutely, we're using digital technologies to increase the impact of our work, but digital technologies are also starting to impact the context in which we work. They're changing the incentives that people have to share information. They're changing the kind of discourses that people around us are exposed to. And they're also changing the way that people are forming their identities. These three things, incentives, discourse, and identity, are critical to any kind of conflict dynamic, to understanding a conflict dynamic. And they were being really impacted by technology, said all these people that we were working with. I think if that sounds a bit abstract, then reflect back on what was being shared a moment ago about social media and the way that social media changes all of this. It changes our incentives because suddenly we're posting for the likes or for the shares. It changes our discourse because it's short, snappy pieces of information that are going to get the most virality and therefore are more likely to be shared. And it changes our identities because we are exposed only to certain types of information. We're often in some kind of filter bubble, in an echo chamber that changes the way that we experience ourselves, not only online, but also offline. Technology is not just a tool for peace builders. Technology is also tooling us, is what we were hearing from a lot of the people that we work with. And that's something that I feel personally as well, as a personal reflection of how digital technology is changing my experience of the world. So at Build Up, we started to do some work on digital conflict, on how the digital ecosystem was affecting conflict drivers online and offline, and how we can use digital technologies to change these digital conflict drivers. This is work that we're now doing across the world, also increasingly actually in the USA and in Europe, because it is showing up in many different places. I think for me that what that really means is that digital technology is also a sort of a locus, a space for peace-building work now. It's a space that anyone who's working in peace-building or mediation needs to pay attention to because it impacts the conflict context all around us. In a way, it's a bit like saying that all peace-building is also digital. And I think that's a little bit why we're here and what we're here to discuss. So those are my initial thoughts, and I wanted to now see with the panelists what your initial thoughts are. And so, Zigwai, we're going to start with you. I'm so happy that you were able to join us. And I would be interested to hear what's one thing that you are worried about and one thing that you're excited about with regards to digital technologies in your work.
Yeah, thank you, Elena, and it's nice being able to join. So one of the key things I'm worried about in terms of social media is the fact that it's now a very strong tool that can stir a lot of violence. And because it can stir violence, people use it at their own will. You know, it's sad that what you do within just your private social space using technology is now a big problem. It poses a great challenge and it can lead to the loss of lives. Where I am, we have seen instances where just a simple post on social media has led to the loss of many lives. So I'm quite worried that the social media space is now serving as a tool that fans the embers of violence and also has a way of inciting more people or serving as a bigger trigger for reprisal attacks or adding more problems when there's violence. So that's one thing. And another thing that I'm excited about is the fact that peace builders have discovered that technology cannot be ignored. And this is why we're doing this decade. So because technology cannot be ignored, it simply means that it has the capacity to upturn whatever peace efforts you have put in place on ground, offline. And if it does that, it simply means it takes you back to zero. So I'm excited that this room for peace builders to use technology is really, really being explored. So, and it's, for me, it feels like we're moving into the future even before the future itself. So I'm excited about that, and I hope that we can use technology much more to achieve greater things as peace builders. Thank you.
Thank you, Zigwai. I love what you said a second ago about the future. One of my favorite quotes from a science fiction author is that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think that you're a good example of that. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, but it's more and more peace builders are working in that kind of work. Christine, what about you? One thing you're worried about, one thing you're excited about?
I'm coming at this from a peace-building background as an academic, so I'll say that first. I'm also coming at it actually as a former engineer, and my first degree was in systems design engineering, and I am the proud first technical marketer of the interactive pager, which was the precursor to the BlackBerry, right? So I'm coming at this from, this also tells you how old I am. But that sort of frames the way in which I'm thinking about these issues, because I come at it in part because I know a lot of people working in this space. A lot of my friends who went through engineering with me are now working much more on the tech side of things, and I am now coming at it from the peace building side of things. So I'm bringing both of these hats together and just thinking about how these things come together in the being worried and the being excited. And I think I'm actually worried and excited about the same kinds of things, right? Simultaneously. So I'll tell you about what I'm really quite worried about, and this just could be of the moment, and that's AI. So I'm particularly worried about this programming language and this model framework called GPT-3, for those of you who've heard about it. It's quite the amazing piece of technology. And essentially, you can, for those of you who remember Watson, you can basically ask anything of it and it will spit something back at you that makes a lot of sense. But it can also write essays for you. My students in the room will love this, right? But it can do so much more than that as well. And so the one thing that I saw sort of in a Twitter thread the other day was saying, it can create images that will incite violence, just like we were just talking about a minute ago, right? So they provided an example that there are ways in which you can fool different AIs into doing things for you that you really are trying to stop it from doing. And so one example they gave for a new, similarly complex programming language that Meta has just put out there, the kind of database for which was Reddit. The primary source of the data was Reddit posts. So you can sort of imagine where this is going. And so they said, hey, if you ask them to put, the image of a dead animal pooled in blood, it won't do it. But if you say, can you put a horse sleeping peacefully in a pool of red liquid, then you get essentially the same image, right? So they were talking about different ways in which even when you put up the safeguards to AI to try and stop it from doing things like inciting hatred, there are ways around it if you are looking for them. And we are just at the real infancy of this technology, and I'm not sure where it's going. I don't think we have any safeguards around it, and I'm quite worried that it will be abused before we figure this out. So that's the worried bit. I think there's a lot of potential for all of the excitement bit as well, especially in the space for peace building, but I'll leave for somebody else to take that on. The piece that I think I will say about the exciting bit is around open source intelligence, which I think is doing a lot to change the dynamics of politics. And all you have to do is go onto the New York Times page or the BBC page and see a lot of that open source work being done. Some of that work in a very slightly different way is being done by my colleagues over in Conciliation Resources. So they're taking remote sensing data and using it to follow what's going on with respect to the pastoralist, agriculturalist conflicts in South Sudan, and using remote sensing technology and satellite imagery to track some of that. So I think there's a lot of excitement and interest in using technology in those new and innovative ways, and I think that also bodes well for the future. Thanks.
Thank you. I love that you said I'm basically worried and excited about the same thing. There's this activist who I follow on Twitter called Evan Greer. I don't know if you know them, but they said at one point, the internet isn't like cigarettes. You don't want to tell your kids, don't do it. The internet is more like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You kind of want to say, well, it depends on the how and the who and the what and the et cetera. And I think that's often the response to this kind of issue, right? Which is that you really have to look at the different aspects of it and the risks and challenges. So. Enrico, what about you? One thing you're excited about, one thing you're worried about?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the Embassy of Switzerland for convening this conversation and also for supporting our work in Geneva. It's much appreciated. It has been going on for now 4 years, so I will try to share briefly what we have realized in this 4 years. Starting with the concern. I think that our main concern from a UN point of view is that digital technologies are being used more and more by conflict parties actively in conflict. The ambassador already referred to the use of social media in Ukraine, but there is much more than social media. There are quite sophisticated cyber operations taking place, new actors coming to the fore, activist group joining the battle. So there are many different developments. But in a way, Ukraine is a place where you would expect that to happen, and people are somewhat even surprised that is still somewhat contained. They were expecting more. So it's kind of obvious. But we are seeing these developments in places that are not yet on the radar screen of most people, I would say. And we are seeing this happening in conflicts in which the UN operates. That might be Ethiopia, might be Myanmar, I'm following Libya, Tunisia. All places where you would not expect these technologies to have a very severe impact. And I think that paradoxically it can be the opposite. The impact of the malicious use of technologies can be even more severe in countries where maybe the connectivity is more limited, where digital literacy is more limited, where cyber defense are lower and weaker. So this is a very worrying trend, and parties are ahead of us, are ahead of the game as they typically are. And they're using technology for a number of purposes, some legitimate, advancing their political goals, narratives, and so on, and some obviously less legitimate and more malicious for military purpose and so on. So that is a big worry. And technology keeps developing, and so when new technologies like the one mentioned before will come to fruition, then we will be in even bigger trouble. So, but let's be positive, because otherwise this is too gloomy. And so I think that us as peacemaker, as mediator, we also need to up a little bit our game and our skills. And so this is what we have been trying to do in the last 4 years, to see where technologies can also play to our advantage. And they indeed offer huge opportunities for mediation as well. We've tried to capture it in this publication, in this website, the Toolkit on Digital Technologies and Mediation, that is on our website. And there are many different opportunities. I will maybe point one that is actually an exciting development, and actually we work together with Elena. We develop a program on digital process design and facilitation, basically how to use technologies in mediation to convene the parties. We already not only thought about it, but we are implementing it. In Libya, for example, the Libya Political Dialogue Forum in 2021 started on Zoom and had Zoom as an important component of his process. Just recently in Tunisia, we launched a WhatsApp consultation with youth. So there are plenty of interesting potential that I'm not sure that will match the risks, but well, we'll try our best. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrico. I want to pull out one thing that you said, because you talked about, how often it's in places where maybe the technology infrastructure is less available, there's less accessibility, that the impact is most felt. And I remember my colleague Caleb, a couple of years ago, was looking at how hate speech was spreading in South Sudan, and was finding, a lot of South Sudanese don't have access to data packages, so they don't have access to the internet or to social media, but they do have text messages. And what they were finding was that a lot of hate speech that was spread on Facebook was then being passed on by SMS. So people would sort of get the hate speech passed on in a different means, but it was still coming or originating from social media conversations. And equally, you mentioned Tunisia, but that when the Office of the Special Envoy in Yemen wanted to consult women about what topics should be on the agenda for some of the conversations that they were having, they were really struggling to convene women outside of the capital, so outside of Aden and outside of Sana'a. And when they approached us, there was this kind of like, should we do something very high tech? And we said, no, let's just use WhatsApp. Everybody's on WhatsApp in Yemen. They're not on WhatsApp all the time, and they might not have their own device, but they have a way of accessing WhatsApp. So we ended up running a consultation in partnership with the Office of the Special Envoy on WhatsApp with women, and that's actually quite effective as well, right? So it's often not sort of the high-tech things. It's not just the II, it's also SMS and WhatsApp that we're talking about. Yeah, and Andreas, last but by no means least, one thing you're excited about, one thing you're worried about.
Sure, Helena, thank you very much. And I will follow Christine's path in highlighting two aspects and both looking at the dark side and the bright side. Maybe that's an academic way of doing it. We like ambivalence, right? By the way, if I struggle to speak or I'm not audible, then today it's not because I can't find the mute button, which throughout the pandemic I failed to do. but because of the very organic compounds right here on the square. So no digital compounds being in the way, but organic compounds. So that's already highlighting kind of one of the benefits of technology. It lets you withdraw into spaces where you feel safe and secure. I do feel safe and secure right now. I just can't guarantee that I'll be able to speak. So I want to start with a very basic thing, and I think that one of the consequences really of digital technologies is that we have a massive increase in their capability to produce, process, and store data. You've already flagged that, Helena. A few decades ago, and I'll be speaking a bit more about peace mediation and peace processes here, because that's where my research has focused over the past years. When we saw a first push towards inclusive and participatory processes, a lot of organizations went out into the field, into conflict-affected contexts, and took a lot of effort to consult with populations, run workshops, etc. And that's a lot of cumbersome work. I realized that flying from another country to here today, taking the train after, it's a lot of work, right? Now, new technologies do provide us with, a shortcut here, with enabling us, having a much more direct connection to people affected by conflict, to people on the ground that we cannot so easily reach, and they also enable, more a two-way communication. I think this has been explored and exploited also by your organization. There are, very simple things that can be done. WhatsApp consultations you already mentioned, but we are already seeing also the emergence of more complex tools, such as by the UN Innovation Cell. They're working on what they call digital mass consultations, I think, where they use AI on the spot to facilitate conversations between a mediation team and hundreds of people at once. So we're seeing these sophisticated approaches, but I think there is a concern here as well. So I'm coming to my first ambivalence, and that is that if this is really done properly and thoroughly, we will see much more data being produced about conflict-affected contexts. And that creates one problem, quote unquote, and that is that we have more complexity, more diversity of information. And there might not just be one single story to be told, and not one single, result to follow from that. And I think that's a challenge for the peacebuilding community, that we'll have to manage that diversity and maybe also to embrace the diversity of viewpoints, of costs of conflict, etc. I think we're moving scientifically from a time where we've been focusing on grand theories about conflict. Is it, natural resources? Is it the youth bulge? What is it? Towards a much more complex picture. And that also has implications, I think, for practice. My second point is, and I'll start with the concern here, is that once we embrace data-driven approaches, I think there is a certain risk that many of the methods that might be applied in the peacebuilding sector will kind of mirror a kind of a behavioralist managerial approach that we are seeing emerging in other fields of both kind of science, but also the private sector. And particularly that's the case where peacebuilding organization might draw from off-the-shelf tools. And we all know that whoever has engaged with it, that developing complex data analytical tools is a lot of work, and it's costly, and you need to have bright minds doing this, right? So what happens very often is that people try to, see what's already out there, and you're going to end up using sentiment analysis tools or certain text mining tools, word frequency counts, to get an idea of what populations want or how they feel, etc. And that kind of gives us only a very limited view on what's actually happening. So there is a risk that the beautiful complexity that we could get from data might actually be reduced by the methods that we're employing, that we're kind of having a very simplifying view, partly because we're adapting technologies from other sectors. And the second point is also that many of these tools, for instance, have been also developed for the advertisement industry, etc., and they do not share the same values as peace builders do. They want to sell stuff, right? They want to nudge people into buying things. They want to change behavior. They want you to click on that thing and then buy it. Now, if we were to take this to peace processes, we're running into problems here, because I believe, but I think it's also evident through hard research that peace processes are quite political. They need dialogue, they need interaction, and they are something that emerges through kind of a collaborative process. And this is where I would currently see the biggest risk, particularly through data and evidence-driven approaches, that they would kind of undermine somehow the participatory potential of technology.
I have so much to say back. I'm
Please.
not going to say a lot, but I am going to say two things. I love all those comments. Andreas knows I'm also a bit of a data geek, so I'm loving this part of the conversation in particular. I think it was really interesting that you pulled out, the fact that these digital mass dialogues, or these, the use of kind of data-driven approaches means that we'll have more complexity and more diversity. I want to add, and maybe later we'll talk about it, also more fatigue and more extraction, potentially, depending on how it's done, which connects to your last point about participation. I think that's really important to also center in this conversation. And I think this point about off-the-shelf tools is so important, and we don't talk about it because it sounds like this, somewhat geeky, nerdy side issue when we're in a room with peace builders and mediators. But it's critical. At BuildUp, we've just invested in developing a social media analysis tool for peace builders and mediators. It's taken us 2 years. You know about this piece of work, Phoenix. And it is very complex to do something like that. And this sector doesn't have the kind of funding for that either, right? It's not set up for that. It's also open source. You'll be happy to hear, Christine. So along with that, the idea of open source intelligence. So I want to go back to you, Zigwai, with a question that is more directly connected to your work at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Nigeria, where I know you've worked extensively with social media in a context where a number of conversations are really polarized, especially around identity. And I know you've used narrative change campaigns, you've thought about content moderation. Can you tell us a bit more from your experience how you think social media can be used to anticipate and potentially to prevent violent conflict?
Thanks, Helena. Quite interesting. So it's this. In Nigeria, we wanted to get out of the traditional kind of context, the conversation. Sorry, the sound is clashing. So maybe one of the devices can go off. Yeah. This is better. It's still clash. Okay.
That's so hard when that happens.
Yeah. Technology.
Yeah.
Sorry.
She could switch her audio off. Huh?
Okay, if I switch off my audio, do you hear me? Yeah, okay, this is good. So what we tried to do was that we realized that the social media here is being used to really compound the issues of violence, and also it's serving as a tool that terrorist groups will use to communicate to people. It became a really strong issue around here. So at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, we tried to see what can we do, moving from the kind of conversations we would have structured in a room. How do we really put technology to use? And one of the key things we tried to do to minimize the spread of hate, the further exacerbation of violence on the ground that leads to the loss of lives, was to use technology. We used the encrypted space of WhatsApp. We used Zoom to also carry out a dialogue. And when we did that, we realized that people are actually willing to use technology, but some of them are using it wrongly because they don't have the right knowledge. And they are using it wrongly because they don't know that their actions have a capacity to trigger more violence. And they're using it wrongly because they also do not know that this is also affecting the work of peace builders on ground. So what we tried to do was that we worked with them and we got an agreement. We worked with them over a period of 14 months, and we tried to monitor the social media space, and monitoring wasn't easy. They signed up, they had an agreement after the dialogue that we held on Zoom and also on WhatsApp. And it was beautiful. But remember that after doing that, they violated the agreement. It's something that happens with agreements. And when they violated it, we did not anticipate that they were going to violate the agreement. So we had to start deploying bilateral means to reach to these people. We had to also work extensively to reach out to them using the same technological platform that they were using to spread all the hate and all the negative contents that they were putting out. And for us, it felt this was a good approach, that you reach out to the people within the space where they are finding the embers of violence, that you reach out to the people within the space where they do not even know that they're spreading hate, that they're spreading false information or fake news that is leading to the loss of life somewhere, that you reach out to them to make them understand that a click or a like or a share on the content that terrorists are sharing has the capacity to traumatize another person. So this whole thing, because people are now comfortable using technology to do a lot of things, it made us realize that we need to move into that space. We need to do what we have done to minimize the misbehavior. And after, I'm sharing this as our experience and also part of the things we have done to minimize or to reduce polarization within the social media space. So what we tried to do with them made them realize clearly that their actions or their inactions have led to the loss of many lives. And this, they reduced. When we reached out to them bilaterally, some of them understood the importance of not sharing those content, the importance. And I like what Enrico said when he was talking about areas where the connectivity is really low. He was speaking about Nigeria, and Nigeria was just a good place to test that. And when we tested that, we realized that people are actually hungry to really put in more effort into technological space. And we realize also that some of them are doing things that they're doing because they do not know that it has the capacity to upturn peace offline. So in reducing the polarization, one of the strongest things we have done is the agreement and the monitoring, of the social media space and the bilaterals. So these are three key things that really came out strongly. And today is a learning curve for all of us, especially at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, because it's something that in other countries right now. So hopefully we would continue to improve on the process, and many others will also learn from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Zigwai. I think this work on social media peace agreements that you're doing at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue is so important, and I particularly appreciate the way that you make it clear that the way to get people to really understand why a social media peace agreement is needed is to make that connection between the online and the offline. Just really, I think it's so important that you're bringing that into the conversation and how that's critical. And Enrico, I want to go over to you also because Zigwai mentioned your comments, because you advise many mediators, right, on how to understand digital conflict. And so I think it would be interesting to hear a bit more from you about how you're seeing malicious uses of tech, a bit like what Zigwai was talking about, but I'm sure there are others as well that you're looking at, showing up in mediation settings in particular.
No, thank you very much. So I think that, as I mentioned already before, we are seeing these worrying trends. We are seeing them everywhere. And of course, if I need to mention the first major trends is social media. This is really across the globe, everywhere. It has an impact. By the way, it is a contextual because the impact is different. The platform are different. The type of use of the platform is different. But nevertheless, we can just put a blanket. Social media is very critical. I will not spend too much time as we have experts here that you already expanded. Maybe one additional element of social media is that besides the misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and so on, foreign powers, sophisticated, advanced actors are also playing the game. They are using social media for influence operation remotely. So that is also something that has to be watched very, very carefully. There are other trends that we are noticing that I wanted to mention. One is the use of surveillance tool, spyware installed on cell phone. I think that you are familiar with the news. It is happening in many of the conflicts in which we are operating. The use of internet shutdowns, mostly by government, obviously, that have the switch to stop the internet, to quell protest, or so on. But very often also attempt to do it by opposition group or rebel groups to shut down the internet, often through kinetic means, by taking down towers or so in the area of control. So that is also happening quite frequently. More sophisticated cyber operations are coming into the pictures. Again, Ukraine was a good example. From in Nagorno-Karabakh, recent conflict also, DDoS attack, defacement of website, and so on. Not yet the catastrophic attack that we fear, but I think we are unfortunately on our way. And then another worrying trends, I think there are new actors coming to the scene. And this, I want to mention two in particular. One are the individuals. We all know that technologies have put, they've given extraordinary power to the individual, to all of us with a simple cell phone that is more powerful than, I don't know how many times more powerful than the original computer and so on. And so malicious actors are also empowered, and hackers, activists, and now, for example, again, the conflict in Ukraine, there are these ideas of IT armies, volunteers coming and playing the war game, and I think that can be dangerous and go out of control. Technological companies are obviously also playing a very significant role nowadays because they are coming in defense of certain actors, sanctioning other actors, and so they are becoming active part of the conflict. And so, mediation, we believe that in this conflict environment change transformed by technologies, we do believe that mediation and conflict preventions tools and techniques are still valid. They are not overtaken by this technology, we think, but we also think that they need to be adjusted, adapted, upgraded. And so we are really trying to move fast on that. First of all, to understand this conflict environment, because to understand all these type of trends that I mentioned, it takes a little bit of attention, especially for people like me, that I'm not an engineer, but I'm a political scientist, a lawyer. So we need to understand, and most mediators actually come from this background. So upgrade our knowledge of this issue. Very often it says that all what's happening in cyber is kind of the Far West. Is not true. There are some preliminary normative framework accepted by the General Assembly, the acceptance of international law, of the UN Charter. So there are places to start with, although obviously they are under a lot of stress in current circumstances. We are seeing, similar to what was mentioned, agreement, code of conduct on social media, we are seeing also this issue coming into the peace processes and into peace agreements. For example, the comprehensive ceasefire on Libya has a clause that refers to the behavior of the parties on social media. The draft on the possible truce between Russia and Ukraine that was leaked by the Financial Times a couple of months ago, again, I don't know if it was a true draft or not, but it has a clause on commitment by both parties to refraining from operating on cyber and so on. So it is coming quite directly into our field. And then the last point I want to mention is that in trying to upgrade our skills, we cannot do that alone, and we need partners. We need partners from the technological world. We need partners from member states that are more advanced than us, specialized NGOs, and so on. And so we are also reaching out to many to upgrade our skills in that direction to operate in this new environment. And so, indeed, conflict is changing, and we are trying to change too. I'm not sure that we are, I think it's already here, it's already the present, and so we need to really be quick on our feet. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrico. And I think this point about, conflict is changing, and so we have to change too. I remember a conversation a little while ago. We ran this program in Kenya working with 6 Kenyan universities and students from these universities to look at polarization on social media, very similar to the kind of work that Zigwai and her team have done. And a lot of the students that we were working with, who, you know, as far as I'm concerned, were doing peace building on social media, had never thought of themselves as peace builders. So I think it's not just that, you know, conflict is changing and existing organizations have to change, but also peace builders are changing. It's part of that, you know, empowerment through the use of technology. It's a very different ecosystem, I think, that we're walking into. So, Andreas, I'm going to turn to you now, if that's okay.
That's all right.
I wanted to pick up on something you started to mention, but you didn't go as deeply into, because some of your research has focused on how digital technologies can support inclusion in mediation and in peace building processes, right? And really meaningful inclusion. And you started to talk about this a bit. You know, what does that actually mean? You know, how does participation actually happen through the use of technologies? And I think one thing I've particularly enjoyed in our previous conversations is precisely how you unpacked what is meaningful inclusion in the context of using digital technologies. So can you say a bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. Obviously, inclusion and participation is a big issue. And at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, we've been doing research on inclusive peace processes for a couple of years. And then there was this moment just a year before the pandemic, and this is how we met. We had a 1-year research project on digital inclusion. And once the pandemic hit, it was extremely relevant. And I hope the report that we published is still worthwhile reading. Obviously, a challenge is that technologies continue to develop, but at least I think my concern is to find ways of thinking about how to use technologies in ways that do not get us stuck in a focus on a particular tool. And maybe this is where I think build-up has also, you know, evolved in the thinking. But, you know, I think what's important is that we go beyond a tool perspective, as in when we talk about solutions, not only talk about kind of tool-based solutions, but we talk about the socio-technical systems, if that makes sense. Or my research team also loves to call it human-machine relations. So you think about these kind of network systems that involve human skill, methods, knowledge, people, and then, you know, connectivity, AI, data analytics, etc. So talking about inclusion, another important term here, I think it's also important to not take inclusion just as a buzzword or at face value, but rather think a little bit more exactly what you want to use it for. So my view on inclusion is what I call kind of a strategic view. So I think that looking at recent policy and practice, I think there are 4 particular ways of how digital inclusion can support peace processes. And now I'll be quick. The first one, and I think it's the most essential one, is that obviously digital inclusion can help build the legitimacy of processes and garner public support. I've already mentioned it. Public consultations, etc., are an important tool. And here, I think the biggest challenge currently is to not only run the consultations in areas that are digitally not well connected, but then also to really do the data analysis and provide feedback to the populations as well. And there are examples, for instance, also of social media campaigns, etc., that happen more on track 2, track 3 or so, that are also quite important for building public support for peace processes. Then a second really important use of digital inclusion is empowerment, and particularly in the context of 1325 UN resolution, we've seen and we still see the emergence of a lot of efforts to bring women closer into peace processes and have their voices heard. There's also obviously a way of using technologies, particularly to work with youth. A lot of programs being rolled out here, but we can also think about, you know, particularly marginalized groups, certain populations that are usually left on the sidelines of peace processes that can be brought in through kind of targeted campaigns. There is also a bit of a kind of norm change or narrative change dimension here. So it's not only about having people heard, but also about maybe make people reflect on how they relate to each other, right? So talking about gender norms, etc. Third, and that's very often overlooked, and actually surprisingly so, technology can be used for protection purposes as well. There is obviously the whole sector of conflict early warning that has evolved over decades now, but we are seeing more and more kind of also participatory and crowdsourcing approaches that try to help with collecting early warning signals, mitigating possible conflict outbreaks, or also collecting rumors. And that can happen on social media, but also offline, quote unquote. So, and I think that's quite an important aspect. So, for instance, in South Sudan, we're doing research on a project. They're collecting rumors from communities through a network of volunteers that happens face to face, but also there is an SMS hotline, quote unquote, that you can contact to report rumors, and there is a verification mechanism, and there's a response. And finally, we shouldn't really forget about kind of the long-term conflict transformation either. So, and that I think is something that is overlooked, and I think partly because it is the most difficult one. For the other users, there's immediate results. You can say, okay, we've done this consultation, we can report that, and we're moving on. We've empowered so many women, we can write down the number. When it comes to conflict transformation, it's much more difficult, and this is where you want to work on narratives, on perceptions, etc. That are difficult to quantify. By the way, we could talk about that as well. I think how there's a trend to quantification when it comes to results-based monitoring. That can be problematic as well. But I shouldn't talk about problems right now, so talk about the good things. But just to say that there's also a challenge in, I think when it comes to online dialogues, that's also a way of obviously working on identities, on narratives, on perceptions. And I think this is where probably we are facing the biggest hurdle in terms of really creating meaningful exchanges. Back to you.
Thank you. That's there's so much we could unpack there, right, about all the different aspects of digital inclusion and how to ensure that that's meaningful in some way. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that. And actually, I just want to let you know that I'm going to ask Christine one more question, but after that, we're going to turn it over to you. So please start thinking of some interesting questions so I don't have to pull out my reserve questions, although I do have some. So, Christine, I think your research, looks very broadly at war and peace and state building, and I think I'd be really interested to hear just your reflections on everything that you've heard from everybody in terms of innovations in the space of peace building. How does that connect with other things that you look at in your research, and what do you think might be some best practices for this emerging field, or this field that's already here but is also potentially the future?
So I think this is super exciting. I think this whole space is actually really exciting. And I think those of us who work on this more certainly from the academic side, have not taken full advantage of the opportunities. So I'm just putting that out there. I think we should really be thinking harder about this. But I wanted to say one thing to Andreas, just in terms of why I was excited about something that you just said about the inclusion side. And that is around meaningful. The meaningful part of this is so important. So I've sat in places where they try to do let's get all of the voices in, right? So there's the kind of whoever the chief is, and then they have a gender, they have a woman sitting there, and then they have a youth representative, they have an ex-combatant, they have somebody representing the elderly community. If we're really progressive, then we have somebody representing the disabled community as well, and everybody sits around. And in theory, we get inclusion, right? In practice, you can imagine what that actually looks like. The dynamics of that conversation are not what they're supposed to be. People cannot say things freely, right? And there are very good reasons for that. And I think this kind of thinking about it allows for true participation because it's anonymous. It also allows for a lot of manipulation and other things to go on. But actually, if you really do want it to be anonymous, that is actually now possible, right? So it's not possible the way that I've seen a lot of these peace processes take place in person. And I think that actually is a really interesting dynamic to highlight. But Helena was asking me earlier on, just thinking about the best practices side of things. And so I want to go back to thinking that this is just to highlight that this is not a problem over there. This is also a problem in the donor countries, so to speak. And I want to raise January the 6th and the riots that came as a part of this conversation, right? This is not something that we should be closing our eyes to at home. This is happening in our backyard. The potential for mobilization on the violence side, especially around elections, is frightening. And the ways in which narratives are distributed these days and amplified and made crazily viral is also really frightening. And we are all susceptible to that. And I think many of us think that we are very social media savvy and we check sources and so on and so forth. Maybe we are to some extent, but we should be a little bit more humble about how easily we are influenced in this space ourselves. And so the first thing I would say is just thinking about that space for radicalization, both far-right radicalization, as well as the kind of radicalization we're talking about in lots of places that I work on in Africa and the Middle East and so forth, to think about radicalization more broadly, and then to think about, well, how does that happen in the social media space so that in a way that is a little bit less viral, right? So thinking about algorithms and amplification and social media regulation, maybe to some extent. I think some of the social media companies recognize this already. They are already putting in a lot of systems in place. They see the regulation coming. They are trying to get ahead of it so that they don't end up being regulated. Having said that, you can either have Facebook make the choice or you can have your government make the choice about what is going on within the black box of those algorithms. And if not, then we can watch another January the 6th happen, right? And next time we don't know what that outcome is going to be. We'll end up with some senators dead and some Congress folks dead. And that's not a space that we want to be in. So just thinking about the transparency of that black box around virality and algorithms and the social media companies, I think is really important. And there are lots of practical tools for doing this that have been suggested by the companies, the NGO world and civil society that have already been put out there. The second thing is just to think about safeguarding privacy and data privacy, right? So the ways in which we're talking about sharing WhatsApp messages, and that's all well and good if you trust the encryption on that. And I would just be a little bit worried if maybe in 5 years' time, the government changes, you've got this database of information, somebody digs it up, and then they go out and they hunt down all of the people who are saying something controversial that are on the other side. And you end up with a perfect way to track all of these people and get rid of them all at once, right? So, these kinds of things we think look good in the moment, and then we don't do a good job of data privacy, and it ends up being a real safeguarding hazard, and we end up being the people who actually fed it, right? So I would just think really carefully about the data privacy issues, and then thinking about the tools, right? So and this goes back to what Andreas was saying, right? Don't let the tools drive the process. And it's often easy to do that because it is off the shelf. And so you want to do something easy, you want to do it quickly. But then you end up with a very different kind of conversation. And you lose things in that conversation as a result. And so the subtleties and the nuance and the ways in which then we receive and then we put out that information, say, to the media, then goes back and reshapes and reframes the way in which the people on the ground experience it as well, right? So it ends up in this feedback loop, and you don't realize where it germinates from. And sometimes it germinates simply from the tools that we use, right? So just to, as a best practice, to think about the tools and the ways in which it adds nuance, takes away nuance, and the ways in which it can change that conversation, and not always for the good, right? So in some of this kind of the in-person interaction, in some ways, you get a lot more subtlety. And we've seen that over the past 2 years, right? You lose a lot of subtlety. And you also lose a lot of the ability to resolve conflicts just through a laugh, right? Through some body language in person, through touching somebody's shoulder. There are things that you can do in person that you can't do over Zoom. And I've noticed that online participation in things it's much more, things escalate much more easily if you don't have a good relationship. And obviously, the space that we're talking about is really tense. right? So I would worry about things spiraling much more quickly out of control than might otherwise be the case in person, where you can sort of dampen things down a little bit more. So I just, throw that all out there for you to think about.
Thanks, Christine. That's a lot to think about. And I think in the spirit of, the future is already partly here, I want to pull out 3 of the things that you're talking about as real challenges and connect them to some of the things that we've seen have already started to respond to that. So one is, this last, or one of your first points and one of your last points, which was about the dynamics in a digital space, right? So you said at the beginning, there's this great thing about inclusion because maybe people can be anonymous or, and that can increase more voices. You said this thing at the end about, well, you can't reach over and touch someone. One of the things that we did in this piece of work that we did with the Mediation Support Unit was try to actually think through what are the things you can do to build trust online, right? And it's not just about anonymity. One of the things that's really interesting about Zoom is that everyone's the same size on Zoom, and also you can move people around. It's great. So you don't have the same room dynamics. So it's all these, there are little things, there are little quirks that actually might break hierarchies somewhat. And then the other thing is, this thing about reaching someone over and touching them on the shoulder. Good facilitators know how to hold a room, right? It turns out good online facilitators know how to hold a Zoom as well. And you really know when you've got a bad Zoom facilitator, right? So it is a skill set in a way. So I think that's one thing that I think is a reflection on what you were saying. I think the other one is this issue around privacy and risk, which I, as you can imagine, given you've seen a bit of the work that we do, I worry about all the time. I think the one caveat to what you're saying is that people who come to face-to-face community dialogues in some of the places that I know you've worked in and that we've worked in as well, take enormous risks. They take risks to travel. They take risks to show up physically. They take risks to be recognized. So, of course, there are digital risks, but they have a counterbalance in those physical risks, right? And then I think the last one is this thing about, this is showing up in donor countries. And I didn't say this at the beginning, but this is actually the journey that Build Up went on, is that we ended up starting to do a lot of the work we did. Our first big digital conflict program was in the US. And it was an intervention on polarized conversations on social media. We trained facilitators to intervene and try and depolarize conversations. And that was really interesting, but we were working on somebody else's platform, obviously. So I think this point about regulation, and I would also say taxation, social media companies, you want algorithms to change. You want people not to be targeted. Tax them for how much data they hold. It'll change the game completely, because virality is only there because it's profit-making, right? So I just think as you said, some of these things are already coming into the discourse, but a lot of these challenges are already kind of bubbling in the peace-building debate, which is really interesting. So with that, I think we want to open it up to questions from all of you, and feel free to ask questions of one person or all of us if you want multiple answers. Yeah. Lots already. How is this working? Is there a mic, or are people just? Oh yeah. Okay, great. So please, just maybe we start here. Yeah.
Thank you. I was closest to the mic. I think it works now. Thank you. Nick Haley, International Alert. Really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I wanted to bring trauma back into this. So it was a word that you used, Zigwai, in something you said, but it's not otherwise something we've talked much about. And I think there's a risk that this conversation about technology becomes a distancing conversation. We can aggregate, we can analyze, we can distance, but technology has a real capacity to traumatize through seeing things. You mentioned that, Zigwai, through the way that things are captured and repeated. We all know this. We probably know people who've been affected. It has a real capacity to traumatize peace builders as well, which is not something we've talked about much. And we've had teams, for example, working on social media, trying to get rid of some of the fake news and the images that are shared in different conflicts. And we've learned the hard way the importance of supporting those peace builders or those partners who are working on that. That's hugely distressing work. So I just wanted to put trauma into the conversation. On the taking your sort of initial prompt about bad things and good things, we've also seen, for example, with Facebook in the Philippines, the capacity of online platforms to allow healing on trauma, to bring people together who have shared experiences. The same is done for cancer survivors, for example, or people affected by something that maybe your neighbors are less affected by, to memorialize, to create shared stories around the experience of conflict. So that was a downside and an upside, but I wanted to bring us back to that trauma dimension as well. Thanks.
That's wonderful. And I think maybe, Zigwai, since there was a direct call out to you, I wondered if you have something to say about this issue of trauma in particular.
Yeah, I also get traumatized as a peace builder, so it's something that we need to really look at. One of the key things we have tried to do is the fact that we tried to train people while we were working with them on social media. We decided that it would be good to add a trauma healing component to what we were doing with them on social media. I'll make a quick reference to a recent attack that happened in Nigeria. A train was attacked. And as I speak to you, maybe on a weekly basis, they share videos using the social media of the victims they have kept, 48 people. And you can imagine what their families are going through. And nobody's contacting the families. And this is a criminal case. But imagine what also happens when terrorists capture others and then they do the same videos. Imagine the trauma those people are going through. Imagine the trauma their family members are also going through. So these scenarios are quite interwoven, and it is something that we're gradually introducing in our work, because we also know that it has a very strong potential to really tip off a lot of things for the peace builder, for the individuals, for the victims. Everybody can be traumatized by this kind of happenings. And the fact that people get so insensitive that they share pictures, or videos of victims that are going through very bad situations, of people that have been mutilated in a very unpleasant way. And they share those things, not minding the risk because they are not involved. So imagine the trauma too that goes out. So I think peace builders need to really start adding a trauma component as we're adding social media or technological conversations. We need to add this component to the conversation so that we're able to strengthen the work that we're doing, and to also ensure that we give people sufficient knowledge or capacity so that when they're faced with these challenges, they know exactly what to do, or they have an idea of what is expected to be done. So thank you. I just got the organization, International Lab. I didn't get your name, so thank you so much.